Hey, welcome to Transform Your Workplace. This podcast is all about exploring ideas, strategies, and stories to help you create a thriving workplace where people can do their best work. Each week, we bring you insights from experts, leaders, and practitioners who are rethinking how we work, lead, and collaborate so you can take those ideas back and make a real impact in your organization. This show is brought to you by Xenium HR, your partner in building a better workplace. Xenium offers a complete HR plus payroll solution, everything from compliance and HR strategy to benefits administration and payroll processing. With Xenium, you get the people, tools, and expertise to help your organization stay compliant, support your employees, and free up your time so you can focus on growing your business. Learn more at xeniumhr.com. Today, I'm joined by Bill Shander, author of Stakeholder Whispering: Uncover What People Need Before Doing What They Ask. Bill's book is all about something every professional faces: figuring out what someone really needs when they ask you to do something. It's about slowing down, asking better questions, and using empathy to uncover the truth behind a request so you can deliver work that truly matters. In this episode, we cover a lot, and you're going to learn why whispering instead of forcing is a more effective way to work with others, how to avoid wasting time, money, and energy on the wrong tasks, simple questioning techniques you can use to get to the real needs behind a request, and how empathy, listening, and critical thinking can make you indispensable at work. So whether you're in HR, leadership, or any role that requires working with other people, and let's face it, that's all of us, this conversation will give you tools you can start using today to improve communication, strengthen relationships, and create better outcomes for everyone. All right, let's jump in. Here is my conversation with Bill Shander. Bill, thanks for coming on Transform Your Workplace.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So you're out with the new book. Late April it came out, Stakeholder Whispering: Uncover What People Need Before Doing What They Ask. I got a chance to read the book. It's great storytelling, it's fun, and it's actionable. So I want to get into it. And at the beginning of the book, you compare stakeholder whispering to horse whispering. And I myself don't really know what horse whispering is, but you outlined what it is pretty good in the book. So turning those like subtle cues and leading with calm instead of force is kind of what I gained from it. And maybe first share a little bit about why you started the book with horse whispering and what they do, and draw a parallel to stakeholder whispering, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. So, it is an interesting comparison, metaphor, whatever you want to call it. Back in the day, yeah, training horses involved, essentially whipping the horses and beating them practically to death to get them to submit to, your will. And back in, I think it was the 18th century, there was an Irishman named John Sullivan, if I remember correctly, who was the first named horse whisperer, who would sort of go into a barn and close the doors, and 20 minutes later he would come out and the horses would be completely calm and relaxed and doing whatever he asked of them. And so the idea that that people thought was happening was he would like literally be whispering in their ear and somehow convincing them, through magic or whatever you want to call it, to get the horses to do what he needed them to do. I use the term stakeholder whispering, which of course echoes that idea. In this case, we're not like submitting, our stakeholders to our will. So I have to make that distinction. But the basic idea that it's all about sort of talking and convincing and using gentler methods to figure out what's going on, that's really what it's all about. So it's just such a fun story. And especially the Mr. Sullivan story, and how like the priest would be walking down the street, and if he saw Sullivan coming the other way, he would literally cross the street because he thought he was like, in league with the devil, which is just sort of a good, fun story.
You said in the book that we should be whispering in everything that we do. What do you mean by that?
The fact is, I mean, there's so many different ways to think about it, but one way is this: that when our stakeholders ask us to do something, the worst thing we can do is just say yes and do it. And there's a whole host of reasons why, but the easiest one is just that we can waste a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort and heartache executing on the wrong tasks, which just wastes an immense amount of all of those things I just mentioned. So if instead of just saying yes, we simply whisper, which is the technique that I describe in the book, meaning talk to our stakeholders and figure out what they really need from us before we do it, then everything is better. We save time, money, and all the rest of it.
You highlighted the whispering with a lowercase w, and you said it's really effective at grabbing attention. Maybe highlight why you think that is.
It's really, I just love, first of all, humans are the only animal that whispers, which I discovered when doing research for the book, which is interesting. But think about how powerful a whisper is. And I think I mentioned this in the book. If you're in a meeting and everyone's yelling, that one person who almost never says anything finally speaks up. They raise their hand. They start speaking very quietly. You can barely hear them. You know, Everyone like leans in and like, whoa, what's going on now? And so it's very engaging. And by the way, everyone around is going to start whispering, speaking more quietly. So there's just something very powerful. I think for all humans, when you hear a true whisper, it makes you feel like you should whisper, you should be quiet, you should be more thoughtful, engaged, etc.
Yeah, that's why I had to ask you about that, because I found that to be powerful, and I was thinking of all the times that I've heard people like whisper, and how you do lean in and you have to like really focus on what they're saying, and so I think is a really good way of grabbing attention. I might use that a little bit more now, and haven't heard that again.
Yeah, and other people will whisper back. It's like contagious,
Right. Yeah. So before we get too deep into the whispering part, I want you to find the other half of the stakeholder whispering phrase, which is stakeholder. Who are they in our day-to-day work lives, and what makes those relationships so critical?
I have to say, and this is going to sound strange coming from me in this context, I hate the word stakeholder. I really don't like
It's
it.
so business jargon to me.
Yeah, I tried to come up with a different name for the book. I could not change it because there is no other word that captures what a stakeholder is. There was a professor at the University of Virginia, the guy who essentially, I think, invented the word stakeholder. At least he invented the whole idea of stakeholder management, stakeholder theory, as it was called then. And the basic idea, and I think his definition of a stakeholder, is anyone who is affected by or can affect something. So it's a very sort of high level definition. And I think in our world, in like the work context, a stakeholder means it's your boss, it's your client, it's your investors, it's your board, it's the media, it's literally anybody who is affected by or can affect this thing that you're working on. And so it's incredibly broad. And so in a way, you could say everybody is a stakeholder in some sense, because, my boss, his spouse is his stakeholder when he goes home, right? Or she. And, the spouse has stakeholders of his or her own, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, ad infinitum. So, but, we have like a narrower set of stakeholders that we're worried about at each moment when we're working on a task at work. And even though there may be 12 of those, maybe I am worried about the board and the investors and the media right now, but really the most key 2 or 3 stakeholders right now are the ones that I really need to focus in on. So it's all those people that are assigning tasks, worrying about the thing that I'm working on, and are going to be affected by the thing that I'm working on. And it's sort of making sure that we're all on the same page so that we're doing the best that we can do.
I think it was the very last paragraph of the entire book. You basically said you couldn't ever define stakeholder whisperer in 2 or 3 paragraphs. And I'm pretty sure throughout the book, you never actually do define it. But I'm putting you on the spot.
Oh boy.
Define it for me the best you can for the listener.
Here's the thing. So I'm going to come at it from the back end. We whisper with our stakeholders because our stakeholders need things from us, right? Our boss assigns it a task and you need to do that task. But that task, like I said, may or may not be what's actually needed. So we whisper our stakeholders in order to help them figure out what their actual needs are so that we can execute on that instead. So a stakeholder whisperer, therefore, is somebody who can hear stakeholder requests, recognize that those requests may or may not be what's actually needed. They may be, by the way, but they may not be. We'll probe with that and we'll investigate that with our stakeholders. And then whatever the outcome is, whatever the actual need is, then we can move on and execute against that task. So it's the people who can listen, recognize that there may be a hidden underlying need, work to uncover that underlying need, and then move ahead against that.
I'm going to transcribe that for you because that actually was beautiful, and that was about a paragraph or 2.
All right, good. That'll be version 2 of the book. I'll put it in there.
In like understanding our stakeholders, you said early in the book, you wrote about stakeholders are human and they have lizard brains and lazy brains, which means they are not always in touch with reality when they make a request or ask for something. You even say in bold that they are not fully in touch with reality. I think it's a pretty provocative statement. And it seems like probably a large reason why you wrote the book in the first place. So, what made you want to explore this messy, very side of the human work and communication through the lens of stakeholder whispering?
I mean, the simple short answer is that when I started my business many, many years ago, like now I do data storytelling and visualization and I do training about that topic, et cetera. But even before I did that work, way back when I was doing web design and development. And the simplest example is that, you know, I'd be working with a client on their website and they would say, make the logo bigger, make all the buttons blue. Be like, okay,
And then do
I
it.
guess I'll make the logo bigger. And I make this giant logo, and they'd be like, the logo's too big. What are you doing? Make it smaller. That actually never happened, probably. But make the buttons blue. No, make them red. Make them blink. And so, you'd execute on these things. You iterate 100 times, and then eventually, maybe, hopefully, you get it right. Right. But the question that I should have been asking, and I learned very quickly to ask, was, okay, when you say you want it to be blue, why should it be blue? What are you trying to accomplish? Well, we want it to be more noticeable, and I want to encourage people to click on it. Okay, so what you need actually is more clicks on buttons. Okay, let's find a solution to make the buttons more clickable. And so that may be making them blue, but it may also be other things. That's been a problem in everything I've ever done. Stakeholders don't know what they need. They are not in touch with reality. And again, not because they're flawed or our bosses are stupid or anything like that. It's because we all truly are not in touch with reality. We're being driven constantly by our subconscious. Everybody listening to this podcast right now, they're having subconscious thoughts that are driving their opinions about what we're talking about, their perception of you and me, et cetera. And we can't help it. And so, especially in a work context where, okay, what do you do when you launch a new product? You make a brochure. Well, I guess I better ask my people to make a brochure. Well, do we need a brochure? Is that the best technique for this product today in 2025? Maybe, maybe not. So, we need to sort of acknowledge that and then, work from that perspective first and foremost. People ask me all the time, well, when I'm like teaching data storytelling, it's like, what's the most important thing I need to learn? You can learn the techniques, you can learn the skills, you can learn the tools, you can learn all kinds of technical things. But the first step, take a step back, is what do they actually need from you? Because if you get that wrong, I don't care how good you are with the tools or anything else, it's going to fail.
You quote Daniel Kahneman several times throughout the book, and most notably his work on thinking fast and slow. And when you were creating or making the logo bigger and changing the button to be blue, like your client was asking, that was fast level thinking, right? That was not slow thinking. Maybe define both of those and how they fit into this discussion about stakeholder whispering.
Yeah, the basic idea Kahneman was building on work done by a lot of psychologists over the years, that they're essentially what's called two systems of thought. System one, which I refer to throughout the book as fast thinking, because system one and two, which one is which, I can't remember. So system one is fast thinking, and that's like the intuitive, that's the lizard brain, the intuitive instinctive response. So like you're walking along and you hear boom, a really loud noise, you duck. That's instinctive fast thinking. You don't even have to, literally, it's not even thinking, it's subconscious. Slow thinking is you're walking along and you hear not a scary like a bear, but you just hear like a whirring sound. I wonder what that could be. I'm in Baja California, sir, right now. There are a lot of ATVs. I wonder if that was an ATV in the distance. I think it might have been. It could also be, you start to investigate and explore and you reason the idea through. That's slow thinking. And in work, like I mentioned before, our fast thinking response, you would think that we're doing a lot of reasoning. You think we're smart people, we're doing important work, we're going to reason through everything. We don't. We're terrible at reasoning. What we do is we're constantly fast thinking. So, I have a new product, make a brochure. New product, make a brochure. And instead of new product, I need to reach more customers. We usually do brochure. That's a fast thinking response. But I wonder if there's another option. Make an app. Oh, wait, that's also fast thinking. Put AI in it. Oh, wait, hold on. We're still fast thinking. And so the fast thinking response, maybe should put AI in it, but let's think it through and really slow it down a bit. And we don't do that very well, which I talk about also in the book, but we can do the best we can, at least by slowing things down and trying to reason our way through things.
I feel like today's age, with so many distractions and cell phones and all of these things around us, that fast thinking is the default.
Yeah.
And critical thinking, that slow level thinking, asking those right questions, being curious, is becoming a more important skill, but not one that many people have.
And yet, survey after survey after survey, you ask recruiters, hirers of all kinds, what key skills do you need in your employees? Critical thinking is always right up there at the top of the list. So people recognize it. And yet even those hirers, they're fast thinking will kick in. Oh, you have good Tableau skills. You're good at CRM. You're good at blah blah blah. Oh, I'm going to hire you. And they sort of forget that they just said yesterday that they need critical thinkers.
You said something that really stuck with me in chapter 3. You said everything you do is creating an experience for someone. And I think that's a powerful idea, especially because most people think of like user experience as it's only for designers. Maybe unpack what you mean by that and how this mindset shift can change the way we lead, communicate, and interact with our stakeholders.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, you usually think of user experience as being for designers, right? So, like back in my world when I was designing websites, what experience do I want my users to have when they're using this website? How do I encourage them to click the button so they buy the thing so that my company makes money? Okay, that's obvious. Starbucks, they sell coffee, but they're not coffee sellers. That's not their real role. They create experiences. You walk in and it's a nice, airy, lot of wood, natural feeling, but kind of dark and moody. But the happy person, and hopefully sometimes in the green apron. There's just a comfortable experience when you go to Starbucks, and a consistent experience. It's the experience of the buying coffee that you're buying, not the actual coffee. And that literally is true of everything. If you are, a company that runs, let's say, gas stations, and if every time I go to your gas station, the stupid credit card thing doesn't work, and the pumps are always messed up, and I got to go inside to pay, and I never get the stupid receipt, that's a bad experience. And that's what I'm going to remember. It's not whether your gas made my car go or not. So it truly is, everything is a user experience, because we don't usually use this word, but we're all users when we're essentially interacting with each other. Maybe we should use a different word, but we're all experiencing that. And it's the experience that we remember, nothing else.
How do we take that mindset, that user experience mindset, and turn this into actionable steps, whether it's redefining what workplace culture looks like by creating experiences like that? Like, how do you do that at mass scale?
I mean, the biggest thing is for people just to be aware of it, and therefore, hopefully, always have that user in mind. And companies use different words for this, right? There's customer experience is one of the phrases that's now sort of in vogue in some companies, which is it's the exact same idea. But I don't care what you do, what your company does. You're selling widgets, you're manufacturing widgets, you're something else, consulting, doesn't matter. Someone is on the other side of that transaction. And that is your user, that is your customer, that's your whoever. And so, in addition to manufacturing a widget that works well and doesn't break and blah, 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 if you also just add in what is the experience of that person when they use this widget as a key component of your process, then it's going to be better. And yeah, you can learn methodologies for user experience, research and designing for users, et cetera. But it starts with acknowledging that you have people on the other side and that you should care about them. And by the way, those are stakeholders, right? So we need to acknowledge our stakeholders and whisper them, understand their needs, which aren't what they asked us for necessarily, but address those actual needs. So like if I'm, developing a product, and Apple's the perfect example. Steve Jobs famously said, people don't know what they want until I show it to them. What do people need? They need things to put to hear stuff, right? But do they need it to be tiny and wireless and easily lost? No, but they need it to be something. And what is the advantage of this thing? Well, it does fit in my pocket and it charges on its own and Bluetooth connect to everything. So it solves my problems. It's not a feature set. And that's probably one of the biggest things you can learn if you're trying to engage with your stakeholders is understand what is their actual problem and work to solve that, not try to deliver against a feature set or a request list.
When you started writing the book or had the concept for it, did you have a person in mind for who would be a stakeholder whisperer? Like, is there any type of person or is it for everybody?
I always knew that in the world of that I came from, right, web design, data visualization, data storytelling, in that world, people already know that their stakeholders don't always know what they need. To your point, when you first said it, you said, it's clear this is for designers, user experience, but who else can benefit from it? So people in that world know that they need this, but no one ever talks about how to do it. But I always thought, and the way I talk about it always is that every knowledge worker needs this. Every knowledge worker. If you're a lawyer, you're working with stakeholders and, your stakeholders say, I need a contract for X, Y, and Z. Well, do you need a contract or do you need something else? Is that the best way I can help you? If you're like, on a production line in a factory, maybe you don't need this as much. So I've sort of tried to sort of say knowledge workers is the biggest target. But honestly, this is like sounds grandiose in a way, but I think this is actually more of a life skill, not just a work thing. But it is a workbook, so I'm focusing on that for the book.
No, I agree with you. Like when I first started like getting into the concept as I was reading it, and then you got to the part two where you really start getting into the how, I was like, oh, these are just skills and you can apply this anywhere,
Yeah.
like at home with your wife,
Yeah.
kids, the workplace. So I want to get into some of the how, because you have some really good ideas. And I do want to encourage people to go get the book because there's so many good nuggets that we're not going to be able to cover on this podcast. But let's start with questions. You said that questions can really lead to amazing things. And I imagine this would be core to stakeholder whispering. What are some of the methods that you outline in the book that of question asking that you think leads to getting people what they want?
Yeah. And I have to start by making a very clear definition of something that people don't haven't learned, and or maybe they learned it back in school but they forgot. And the Socratic method is what I talk about in the book a lot, and that's the method of asking questions. But what people think when they hear, oh, ask questions, they think that what I'm recommending is you're trying to learn what your stakeholders need, so you ask questions and then you'll learn the answers. So the learning is directional towards you, the question asker. That's true. Like if I ask you a question and you tell me the answer, I will learn from that. But the key to stakeholder whispering is that it's actually the opposite direction also. And that's what the Socratic method was actually about. Socrates, in order to teach his students, would ask them questions. The act of responding to the questions is you teaching yourself. So if I have a stakeholder who says, hey, do X, Y, or Z, and I start peppering them with questions, it's not about me learning the answers from them as much as it's about them learning from my questions the answers themselves. Because our job as stakeholder whisperers, which is also should be added to that definition we talked about earlier, is we're guides. We are helping our stakeholders figure out what they need because, as I talk about in the book, it's really like therapy. So if someone goes to therapy and they say, oh, I'm really depressed, my life is a mess. And what does the therapist say? They don't say, well, do X, Y, and Z. They say, how does that make you feel? They say, what do you think is going wrong? What do you think you should do about it? So like they probe them with questions and then they figure out for themselves what they should be doing. So that's what questioning is really all about, is getting them thinking so they can figure out what their needs really are. And then you can, also figure it out with them. So that's the first part. The second part of your question, like specifically, what kind of methodology do I use? One of the techniques that I describe in the book, I call the dance of the 6 Ws. And the basic idea of the 6 Ws, who, what, when, where, why, and how. How is an honorary W word. Some of those questions are what's called divergent questions, right? They open up to more and more possibilities, like why? The ultimate divergent question. Tell me why you want the buttons to be blue on your website. And if you could wax on and do like 1,000-word essay about the whys. But if you ask someone a more convergent question, when? Well, it's due next Thursday, right? Like that's easy. And so the key is you want to ask divergent and convergent questions. And it's the dance between the two that eventually leads to, if there's any complexity to the situation, and if the initial request was not what's needed, blue buttons, at some point, well, why do you need a blue button? What are you trying to accomplish? Who's going to use the blue button? What do you want them to really do with the blue button? All of a sudden, they'll be like, whoa, whoa, hold on. Yeah. You know what I need? I need just more clicks. It doesn't need to be blue. You're right. Now we can figure out how to actually solve that problem. One of the phrases someone used with me, which stuck really well, is that they own the problem and you own the solution. And good questions will lead them to figure out what their problem really is. And then you can work together to come up with a solution for it.
It's pretty amazing that we need to be reminded of question asking, because kids are really good at this. They ask why, and then we're able to get, as parents or whatever, we're able to get a lot deeper and explain things to them so they can have a level of understanding. It's amazing that we lose this skill.
It's so true. In fact, I wish I had included that in the book. It's a very good point.
I mean, later on in the book, you have that whole chapter about question asking, and you've got a lot of really good methods, including the whys. So I love that section. We already talked about fast thinking and slow thinking, but there's a nugget in there about how we make predictions and do what you call nexting. How do we unlock the slow thinking in those moments where we're just like one step ahead, making predictions, nexting, as you're saying? Because I think this is a real skill that we need to develop.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, and I didn't come up with next thing. I have to give credit to Daniel Gilbert, who used that term next thing in his book, Stumbling on Happiness. But yeah, the basic idea is that we're always nexting, and it's just like fast thinking. It's the same idea, but he specifically talks about it in the example he uses. Like we do it all the time, like when we're reading. We don't actually read individual words. That's where we can read so quickly because we're constantly predicting the next word as we're sort of skimming along. And we're really good at it. And we're good at it in reading. And by the way, we're good at it when there's a loud noise, we duck or we run or whatever we're supposed to be doing in those nexting situations. And in work, sometimes that serves us, just like other types of fast thinking. But yeah, we need to slow it down, acknowledge, by the way, that we're going to still be doing it. Like I did before, like, new product brochure, how about AI? How about, every idea I'm going to come up with, the first 10 of them are going to be like the stupid nexting response. One of those might be right, by the way. But if I keep trying, kind of like the kid asking why, on the 12th why is the sky blue? Really? You know what? I guess maybe I should look it up. Maybe I should really try to think it through. And the same thing. Eventually, I'll come up with another idea. And I think what happens over time is our fast thinking can deliver good results and our intuitive response can be very productive. But we know it is. And it's not that we should learn to distrust it at all times. We just need to learn to investigate it. So, and I do think that your intuitive response serves you really well in a lot of situations. And, one example is that, I've been through every tech hype cycle there's been since 1990, like, .com, Web 2.0, VR, like all the stupid trends that came along and then flew out the window. Some of them stuck and some of them didn't. AI feels like that, but it isn't. Yeah, AI is truly transformational. And so the first intuitive response to, oh God, put AI in it, sure. But the immediate second fast response is, yeah, but like, of course, you should be doing it and experimenting with it. And so I think over time, our intuitive response gets honed and we can learn to trust it. But even so, we should investigate it because, we do know our fast thinking doesn't always serve us. So just probe everything, but also you got to learn to trust your gut to some degree.
The biggest example I can think of in fast thinking is actually generative AI. It's literally making predictions based on your prompt. So if you want to see it from a reverse perspective, it's like put in the most broad response or prompt that you can think of, and generative AI is fast thinking. It's giving you what it thinks you want in terms of it's predicting your next thought. You could prompt it to say, like, maybe ask me a clarifying question or something that we should do as stakeholder whisperers. Right, it's like going a layer deep, but to understand what I'm actually asking it.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And what's interesting about AI, and I talk about this, and I'm doing, I'm presenting the book in speeches at conferences and whatnot. And in the conference, one of the things I say is, one of the arguments for stakeholder whispering is AI, right? Because when your stakeholders can just put their tasks onto AI will just do it, right? It'll just put its head down and do what's requested of it. So what advantage do we have as workers over AI? And they may all disappear soon, but one of them, I would argue, is the ability to ask unexpected follow-up questions. So while you can prompt AI and say, yeah, ask me clarifying questions, AI is going to come up with predictable clarifying questions because it can't imagine things beyond what the data it's trained on has experienced. Humans can still come up with unexpected questions. We can dance around those 6 W's in sort of unexpected ways in order to prompt that more thoughtful response from our stakeholders. And like I said, I don't know when AI will replace even our skills at that, but for now, I think that's an advantage humans have.
We talked a little bit earlier about how we're just so distracted because of all these tools and tech and smartphones. And you'd probably agree with me when I say, like, I don't think people are listening to their fullest capabilities. And if we're talking about stakeholder whisperers, they've got to have this listening skill set. And I want to know from you, how do we stretch this muscle, the listening muscle? How do we focus better so we can give our stakeholders what they want?
Well, I just did an interview I do like a weekly LinkedIn Live about stakeholder whispering, and I'm interviewing other people to ask them for their experiences, stories, et cetera. And someone who was on last week used a great phrase about listening. He said, learn to listen with your ears, not your brain. And the point is, listen, don't think. Try not to think. Try not to be listening and analyzing at the same time, listening and coming up with your follow-up question at the same time, etc. So, it's a muscle. It's like, how can you learn to lift 300 pounds? You can't. You just got to work at it. And I think listening is one of those skills that there's no trick, except that phrasing is a little bit of a trick. Listen with your ears, not your mind. Because if I really focus on like, what am I actually hearing? And I'll parse it later and I'll question it later, then I'm really taking in the information rather than immediately coming up with my response to it.
What role does empathy play in stakeholder whispering, especially when somebody doesn't have a shared lived experience?
Yeah, I mean, empathy is a mission critical component of it. I have a whole chapter on empathy for that reason. You can't do stakeholder whispering unless you have empathy for your stakeholders. The example is like, you hate your boss, you hate your job, you hate everything about everything that you do. And so your boss assigns you a task, you're not going to be whispering them because you couldn't care less, And even if you did, or you tried to because you want to get that promotion so you can get a better job next year somewhere else, it's not going to work out well because you don't have the empathy. Empathy it's not necessarily liking somebody, right? It's not necessarily having the same lived experience, but it is doing the best you can to imagine being in their shoes. And it's kind of like product design, right? I can ask people, what do you need from me? And they'll tell me things. And, Henry Ford and Steve Jobs' family, he said, take it all with a grain of salt. But instead, if I'm a person who has ears, and I do, and I use these things and I know how I would like to improve these, I'm going to do a better job improving them for myself. And so if I'm the designer of these, I can talk to people like me and, translate what they're saying and try to get that converted into useful information. But if I could be them, or as close to that as I could possibly can get, which is what empathy is, then I can intuit some of that stuff myself. Combination of the two, works really well together.
You had wrote in the book that some of the big business names of our time have said that constraints are our friend. Do you believe that? And how do we use that notion as a basis for stakeholder whispering?
I definitely believe that. I've experienced it in every probably situation in my work life, right? Like, if you have nothing but endless time and budget and whatever to accomplish X, Y, or Z, then you can just go down a rabbit hole and you never solve a problem. When you have a constraint like a budget or a timeline, it forces you to make decisions. And certain people need that more than others. Some people are very good at making decisions and they don't even need those constraints as much. But with stakeholder whispering, the constraints, there will be constraints on the conversation itself, right? Like, one of the examples I share in the book, a failure of stakeholder whispering on my part was I couldn't get the time with my ultimate stakeholder in order to really figure out what I should be working on. I take responsibility for it. I should have recognized that and done something about it. But that was a constraint, and that did not serve me or the project well at all. That being said, like I said, if I had recognized it, maybe I could have worked around it. So you're always dealing with constraints, and that's just a reality. Nothing in life isn't constrained. Like I would love to be able to, fly to Iceland and check out the Northern Lights tomorrow night, but I have a constraint on my time. But if I could snap my fingers, I would do it. Well, that's a constraint. I can't. So I make other decisions in order to deal with the reality that I'm stuck with. So I have my own constraints. My stakeholders have their constraints, which, by the way, brings us back to empathy. So my stakeholders need X, Y, and Z from me. I probe with them. Maybe they don't have enough time to talk with me. Maybe they don't have enough budget to solve it the way I think it could be solved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Recognizing those constraints, dealing within those constraints with empathy is, one of the key things to do stakeholder whispering well.
A lot of the actions we've talked about on this podcast and within your book, they seem to be really good for one-on-one stakeholder whispering. What if you find yourself in a group setting where you might have somebody that takes up a lot of air in the room, maybe a lot of different titles, so there's hierarchy involved?
Yeah.
How do we stakeholder whisper in those situations?
Yeah, so I actually have a chapter, called Whispering en Masse, which is exactly about the idea. There are different dynamics at play. One thing is that, recognizing to your first comment there, there's always somebody who's going to take up all the air. It may or may not be the stakeholder. It may just be a different kind of squeaky wheel in the room. It's recognizing that and acknowledging that some group whispering sessions may not go to plan, and working in smaller sessions or one-on-ones when you can. But there are also techniques. And so like one of the techniques I share in the book, I start off that chapter with an embarrassing story from my own personal life.
Oh yeah, that
And
was
yeah,
good
and
stuff.
comes out of left field. You're like, why on earth is he writing about this in
Yeah,
this
what
book?
does this have to do with anything?
And I'll leave that one, for everyone's imagination. Go buy the book. You'll learn. You'll get a fun little read out of that. But there was reason for it, and there was research that was done that found at the beginning of a brainstorming session, which is a group setting, if you tell an embarrassing story at the beginning, you get more and better ideas from the group. So there are techniques to make even a group session like that, even when you have squeaky wheels, etc., have more productive group sessions. So I share a couple of those in the book. But one of the other things I talk about in the book is recognizing that there are some troublesome characters you'll run into, some people who aren't whisperable, some people who will disrupt the whispering process, and some ideas about how to deal with those too, because that's just the reality that we live in.
I'm glad you put in the embarrassing story, and I'm really happy it had a good a good outcome.
What's funny is that the speech that I'm developing the entire speech starts off with a similar topic, but not exactly the same. Another embarrassing story from my childhood that's very right on the line with that one. And I start out by I'm lying on the floor, also telling the story like a therapy session. So like my speech is also equally sort of accessible and irreverent, let's say.
I love it because it connects people. It's relatable. Even in reading this, I'm like, I've had so many moments like that. Close calls.
Yeah.
We'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
And just kind of wrapping up this discussion, you had said in the book that stakeholder whispering is a way of seeing the world. It's not something we check off. It's not a check the box thing. What are a few ways that you encourage people to just make sure that this is part of their everyday?
It's not exactly a technique, but one of the ideas in the book, the phrase that I use is you need to tap into what I call your useful paranoia. Yeah, that's critical thinking, essentially. It's the just constantly be aware that nothing is as it seems, which is, by the way, the first chapter in the book, the title of it. Literally nothing is as it seems. Everything is driven by the subconscious, and therefore you should be investigating everything. That's a state of mind. And like you said earlier, designers learn this very, very early in their careers. Bosses ask for blue buttons. They don't know what they actually need. Your job is to help them figure it out. Although not all designers have really ingested that fully. So the state of mind change really is just as simple as that. Just be aware that work is work. Bosses ask for stuff. You want to be, helpful, but you don't want to be an order taker. So investigate everything, discover the true underlying need, and solve those instead of that initial request. And by the way, 99% of the time, I shouldn't put a number on it. Most bosses will appreciate that. Most bosses will promote you for being that kind of worker. And those that don't aren't good bosses, and you should find a new one, because that's really what you want. Is you want to be working somewhere where you're valued for digging for true needs, not simply being paid to be an order taker.
Bill's book is called Stakeholder Whispering, Uncover What People Need Before Doing What They Ask. Bill, such a good book. I appreciated the conversation. Where do you want to point people to? Connect with you on LinkedIn or anything like that?
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. Yeah, you can definitely find me on LinkedIn for sure. And also my website, billshander.com.
My guest today has been Bill Shander, the author of Stakeholder Whispering. Bill, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Brandon. I really had a good time.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.